Have you ever watched your entire life come undone? Not with a bang, but with an envelope? The kind that just sits on your kitchen table. Silent, harmless, until you open it and realize it's the beginning of the end. This is a story about a man who had already lost too much, and a woman who fell literally out of the sky. Neither of them was supposed to save the other, but fate doesn't ask for permission. So what happens when hope crashes straight into your backyard, covered in smoke, mystery, and a name you're not supposed to recognize? Well, let me take you to a quiet farm in Oklahoma. On the night everything changed. The wind that evening didn't whisper. It roared out across the wide Oklahoma fields, where the soil was cracked from too many dry seasons and not enough rain. A storm was rolling in, the kind that doesn't just soak the land. It breaks it open, but inside a small, weather-worn farmhouse, another storm had already landed. Blair Cole sat at his kitchen table, elbows on faded wood, eyes fixed on a white envelope. It was already opened. He'd read the words 3 times. Still, they didn't make sense. Final notice. Foreclosure imminent. He wanted to feel something, panic, anger, grief, but what he felt was nothing, just a kind of stillness, like the quiet before the sky splits open. This farm had been in his family for 3 generations. It was where he'd learned to drive a tractor before he could reach the pedals, where his daughter had once built fairy houses under the oak tree, where his wife, Sarah, had sat on the porch swing humming old gospel songs until the cancer took her away. Now the bank wanted it all. He had tried, Lord knows he had, selling tools, picking up part-time work in town, skipping meals so the chickens could eat. But in the end, math didn't care about effort. It cared about numbers. And Blair didn't have enough of them. And sometimes when it rains, it doesn't stop. Outside, thunder cracked like a broken bone. Blair didn't flinch. He just lifted the chipped mug of black coffee to his lips, his hands worn, dirt still under the fingernails, and stared into a future that had already begun to disappear. What he didn't know, what none of us ever really expect, is that sometimes life takes everything from you, so it can bring something else crashing in. Something or someone you never saw coming. That night, while Blair sat staring at the end of the road, something roared overhead, low, unnatural, wrong. And when the ground shook seconds later, his story was no longer just about survival. It was about to become a story of rescue, of redemption, and of a woman who would fall from the sky and change everything. Next, let me show you how a single scream in the sky turned into a second chance on the ground. It started like any other storm, until it didn't. The wind shifted. The sky changed color. Not just gray, but something darker, like bruised metal stretched across the clouds. Blair had just stood up to pour himself another cup of coffee when the sound came. Not thunder, not wind, but something mechanical, low, violent, wrong. He rushed to the window, heart racing. And then, a flash of red light tore across the sky like a wound, followed by a sound that shook the farmhouse from its bones. Then silence, but only for a breath. The next thing he saw was smoke. No one ever prepares you for moments like that. You think you'll freeze. But Blair didn't. He grabbed the first aid kit that hadn't been touched in years, threw on his old canvas coat, and ran out into the storm, into the unknown, guided by nothing but instinct and the curl of smoke against the rain. The field behind the barn looked like a war zone. A small plane had ripped through the crops, its twisted metal still sparking in the wet dirt. One wing sheared off, the other barely hanging on. And in the cockpit, there was someone, a woman, slumped forward, blood streaking down her forehead. Alive, but barely. Blair didn't think. He moved, ripped the door open, braced against fire and glass, and pulled her free, her body limp, her flight suit torn, her leg, God help her, impaled by a jagged piece of steel. She screamed as he moved her, a sound that cut straight through the wind and into his chest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He dragged her to safety, set her down beneath the old oak, and called 911, but help wouldn't come. The storm was too strong. Roads were flooded. They told him to wait. But Blair knew what waiting would cost. So with hands shaking and breath shallow, he opened that old kit and did what he hadn't done in years. Patch a wound deep enough to scare him. He sterilized the metal, wrapped her leg with gauze and a torn piece of his own shirt, and whispered, "Stay with me. You don't quit on me now." And maybe it was a storm. Maybe it was something more. But she did. She stayed. When the sun rose the next morning, the wreckage still smoked in the distance, and Blair sat beside a stranger who wasn't just alive, but somehow familiar in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story, but what he felt, for the first time in a very long time, was hope. Sparkles a quiet moment in chaos, can still plant the first seed of change. And that's the thing about storms. They destroy, but they also reveal. And as Blair would soon discover, this woman didn't just fall from the sky. She was carrying secrets powerful enough to change everything, starting with the farm. Let's talk about what happened when that stranger finally opened her eyes. The spare room hadn't been touched in years. Blair's daughter used to sleep there, back when bedtime meant fairy tales and glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Now it was more of a storage corner. Boxes, books, an old quilt still smelling faintly of lavender. That's where he laid her. The woman from the crash. The stranger. She hadn't woken yet. Only stirred once in the night, groaning through her bandaged leg, caught somewhere between pain and sleep. But by morning, she opened her eyes. They were sharp, not the eyes of someone groggy or dazed. They scanned the room like they were looking for exits, like someone trained not to panic, but to calculate. "Where am I?" she asked, voice hoarse but steady. Blair crouched by the bed, checking her bandages. "You crashed in my field. You're lucky to be alive." She blinked slowly, then nodded, almost too calmly. "Right, the storm. The engine, it went out." She took the glass of water he offered, drank like someone used a rationing, efficient, measured, precise. And when he asked her name, there was the slightest hesitation before she answered. "Nora." It was small, but Blair noticed, and over the next 2 days, he noticed more. She should have been resting. But every time he turned around, she was doing something she wasn't supposed to. One morning, he caught her studying his tools, running her fingers across the wrenches and clamps like she'd used them her whole life. That afternoon, she took apart his old shortwave radio, cleaned the wires, and reassembled it. No manual, no hesitation. The next morning, she was on the porch, carving a piece of wood with the kind of focus that didn't come from boredom. It came from discipline. She moved like someone who had been trained, not just taught, conditioned. And Blair, he wasn't blind. He'd served once, long ago. He knew the signs of someone used to pressure, to protocol, to hiding things behind a calm exterior. But he didn't press. He asked gently, "Where'd you learn to fly?" She looked up from her tea, gave a faint smile. "Private instruction, a long time ago." He nodded, but the way she held herself, the way her fingers moved when she checked the kitchen's wiring box for a faulty switch, that wasn't private instruction. That was muscle memory. And that's when it started to sink in. She hadn't just crashed from the sky. She'd come from a different kind of world entirely. One where people carried secrets like luggage, tight, heavy, never letting them touch the floor. Sometimes, people enter our lives wearing borrowed names and borrowed stories. But the truth always finds a way to speak, even if it whispers through the cracks. Blair could have pushed. He could have asked the hard questions. But instead, he poured her another cup of tea, because sometimes the best way to hear a story is to wait until someone's ready to tell it. And while Nora hadn't told him who she really was yet, her actions were already speaking volumes, especially when she walked into the heart of Blair's struggle and began to change it one small question at a time. Let's talk about how this stranger, this maybe not just a pilot, started fixing more than just herself. In the quiet hours of a fresh Oklahoma morning, something unexpected began to happen on Blair's farm. While the storm had washed away the remnants of yesterday's fear, also cleared the path for new beginnings. Nora, still recovering, still a mystery, began to reveal small hints of her past. One crisp morning, as Blair gingerly sipped his coffee on the porch, he noticed her eyes fixed intently on a pile of unopened bills and scattered receipts sitting on his kitchen counter. Curious, he followed her lead into the living room, where she sat at the worn table with a handful of tools he'd long forgotten. Without a word, she pulled out a scrap of paper and a well-worn pen. On that napkin, with almost casual precision, she began scribbling down numbers and sketches. She drew a rough diagram of his fields, carefully marking crop rotation plans, potential zones for new produce, and even highlighted the deteriorating parts of the old greenhouse. Blair watched, fascinated. Here was a woman, fresh from a calamitous crash, who knew her way around machines, wires, and even financial planning. As if on cue, she explained in a soft, measured tone, "You see, Mr. Cole, these numbers. If we adjust the rotation and focus on high-end greens and heirloom vegetables, we can pull a premium from local restaurants. It's like planting a seed for something bigger, something that grows quietly but powerfully." Her words were simple yet profound. She wasn't just fixing broken tools. She was fixing a way of life. Blair's mind raced with memories of his father's old ledger, an afternoon spent counting every dollar and dime. Now, here was Nora, turning a handful of figures on a napkin into a vision of hope for the future of his farm. In that moment, Blair realized that sometimes the smallest details, like a napkin filled with numbers, could hold the power to change everything. It wasn't just about survival. It was about reinventing what he thought was lost. With every stroke of her pen, Nora was mapping out not just the potential of the land, but of his life itself. A lesson learned. Innovation often comes in humble, unexpected packages. It doesn't always arrive with grand announcements. It might just be etched on a simple napkin, waiting for someone willing to see beyond the immediate chaos. Blair felt a stirring inside him, a feeling that perhaps this was the answer he'd been waiting for. A gentle nudge that reminded him of the importance of small beginnings and brave new ideas. As the day went on, the farm started to breathe with new purpose. And soon, Nora's ideas would not only transform the fields, but also challenge Blair to rethink everything he knew about farming, and even about himself. Let's now see how this transformation took shape as Nora's vision spread across the land, turning old mistakes into new growth. It was nearly midnight when Blair heard the soft crunch of gravel outside. The wind had died down, and the sky above the farm was clear, a quiet kind of peace that didn't come often. But out by the barn, something moved. Not an animal, not wind. Something slower, more deliberate. Blair paused, hand hovering near the doorknob. Years of instinct told him, this isn't right. He reached behind the old cupboard where he kept his grandfather's shotgun, loaded it with care, and stepped out into the night barefoot, letting the porch creak beneath him. His eyes adjusted to the dark as he moved toward the barn, every step a whisper. And then he saw him, a man dressed in black, standing still just outside the barn doors, not doing anything, just watching the house. Blair raised the shotgun. "Don't move." The figure turned slowly, hands raised. "Easy, friend. I'm just looking for someone." Blair's jaw tightened. "Someone who fell out of the sky?" The man smiled. "She goes by Nora, doesn't she?" The name hit the night, like a rock dropped into still water. Blair didn't answer, but his silence said enough. "She doesn't belong here," the man added calmly. "She belongs to people with responsibilities. You don't want to be in the middle of this." That was the moment Blair stepped forward and fired into the dirt, the crack of the gun loud enough to wake the ghosts. "You don't come back here," he said, voice like iron. "You do, and it'll be more than a warning." The man backed away without another word, fading into the dark like he'd never been there at all. Back inside the house, Nora was sitting upright on the couch, pale and shaking. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. Blair didn't yell. He didn't demand. He just sat down across from her, calm but tired, and asked the question that had been on his tongue for days. "Who are you, really?" She looked down. Her fingers twisted in her lap. "I want to tell you," she whispered. "I do, but not yet." "And here's the strange part," Blair nodded. because deep down he already knew the truth. This woman wasn't just a pilot, and she wasn't just running from a crash. She was running from a life that had stopped feeling like hers. A lesson in that night. Sometimes people lie not to deceive, but to survive. And when they finally choose to tell the truth, it means they're starting to trust again. Blair didn't need all the answers in that moment. He just needed one reason to believe she wasn't here to hurt him. And strangely enough, he found it in her silence. But secrets have a way of catching up. And while Nora tried to leave her past behind, the world she came from was already on its way back to claim her. Let's talk about what happened the day her truth came knocking, with black SUVs and a name that made everything unravel. It began with a buzz. Blair was out by the west fence, repairing a broken post, when his phone lit up. The screen showed a news alert, but it was a photo that made his heart stumble. Nora, stepping off a private jet, flanked by men in uniform, hair pulled back, sharp sunglasses, expression guarded. And the name beneath it? Nora Everstone, heiress to Everstone Aerospace. Found alive after a month of disappearance. Blair's breath left his chest like he'd been punched. Everstone, that name was carved into the rejection letter he'd burned in the fireplace months ago. The same corporate empire that had swallowed his loan request, that had bought the bank, that held his mortgage, that had never even looked him in the eye as it pushed him closer to losing the land. Now that name had been living under his roof, healing in his daughter's old room, and planting hope in his fields. He didn't walk, he ran, stormed back to the house. Through the door open, Nora was standing in the kitchen, phone still in hand. She had seen the article too. Her face said it all. "You knew," Blair said, voice low and tight. "I was going to tell you," she started. "But you didn't," he cut in, eyes flashing. "You walked in here with your real name buried and watched me fall for a story that wasn't even yours." "I just needed to disappear for a while," she said quietly. "To feel like a person, not a headline. I didn't plan to land here. I didn't plan any of this." Blair laughed, hollow and bitter. "You ever think about the kind of damage your company leaves behind? About the people who don't get to disappear? Who lose everything while you play it being normal?" She stepped closer. "I didn't know they denied your loan. I swear." He shook his head. "No, you didn't know. Because people like you don't see people like me." That's when they heard it. Engines, dozens of them. Black SUVs kicking up dust as they crawled up the old dirt road. Sirens low but unmistakable. One by one, they pulled into the driveway like a funeral procession dressed in tinted glass and quiet power. Men in suits fanned out. Cameras. Radios. And then her father. Tall. Silver-haired. Sharp-jawed. Cold. He walked into the house like he still owned every room his daughter entered. "It's time to go," he said. Nora didn't argue. She didn't cry. But her eyes, those same eyes that had once softened in the morning light, they pleaded. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she told Blair. "You were the first real thing I'd felt in years." And just like that, she was gone, taken not in handcuffs, but in silence, like something precious being repossessed. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives in a suit, drives a luxury car, and leaves you standing in your own home, feeling like a stranger. Blair didn't move for a long time, just stood there, hands clenched at his sides, staring at the empty space where she had been. Later that night, he sat in front of the laptop she'd used to build his budget, plan his crops, outline his future. He picked it up and threw it across the room. Glass shattered, spreadsheets gone, dreams scattered. Because the hardest kind of betrayal is when the person who brought you back to life turns out to be part of what tried to bury you in the first place. But even after she was gone, even after the silence returned to the farmhouse like a second storm, Nora had left behind more than lies. She'd also left behind a seed. And what Blair found on his porch the next morning would be the beginning of something no one, not even the Everstones, could control. Let's talk about the envelope that changed everything. Again, for 2 days, the farmhouse didn't make a sound. The radio stayed off. The porch swing barely moved. And Blair Cole, once held together by calluses and coffee, sat in his empty kitchen, staring at the dent in the wall where her laptop had hit. No one called. No one stopped by, not even the neighbor who used to wave every morning from his tractor. The Everstone name had traveled fast, and not in the way that helped. Word had gotten out that Blair had harbored a missing heiress. Even though no charges were filed, the whispers did their job. Buyers backed out of crop orders. Equipment deliveries were postponed indefinitely. And the greenhouse he and Nora built by hand, padlocked, under review. It was the cruelest kind of irony. The same hands that had pulled someone from the fire were now being punished for touching it. And for the first time in weeks, Blair didn't fight it. He let the silence in. Didn't fix fences. Didn't feed the chickens. Didn't hope. Until the morning he opened the front door and saw the envelope. Plain, manila, no name, no stamp, just tucked beneath a smooth stone like a gift left by the wind. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a business plan. His name was written at the top in clean, looping handwriting he knew by heart. It wasn't just the same outline they'd sketched together. It was better, refined, focused. It mapped out new crop rotations, included vendor contacts, community programs, potential grant partners, and a volunteer schedule that somehow already had names on it. And in the corner, a sticky note, in blue ink: if you still believe in seeds, plant them. Some only grow in the ashes. And Blair sat on the porch steps with the paper in his lap. For a long, long time, he didn't cry. Not yet, but something shifted, not in his bones, in the soil beneath them. Because sometimes people leave without saying goodbye, but they still leave behind something that grows. Hope doesn't always knock. Sometimes it gets tucked under a stone, in an envelope with no return address. But it still knows exactly where to land. That afternoon, Blair pulled the tarp off his tractor. By nightfall, he was digging again. This time, not to survive, but to rebuild. He even filmed a short video with his old phone, hands dirty, voice trembling slightly. My name's Blair Cole. I'm a farmer. I've lost a lot, but I haven't lost what matters most: belief. If you believe food should come from honest hands and honest land, I could use your help. He uploaded it to a crowdfunding site, went to bed without much hope. By morning, the video had 3,000 shares. By the end of the week, donations poured in from former customers, neighbors who changed their minds, even strangers who just liked the way he said, honest land. Local students signed up to volunteer. A retired teacher offered to run after-school workshops. And someone anonymous sent a truckload of new tools with a card that simply said, keep building. And just like that, the farm that had been one man's burden began turning into everyone's project. But even as the rows of kale and carrots grew stronger each day, there was still one person missing from harvest until the day she returned. Not in a plane, not in a headline, but in the only way that ever mattered, on foot with truth in her hands. Let's talk about what happened when Nora finally came home. Blair had never been much for cameras. He wasn't the kind of man who posted selfies or check likes. But that morning, knees stained with soil, palms blistered from turning earth, he felt something stir in him that words alone couldn't hold. He set his phone on a rusted toolbox, pressed record, and stood in front of the field. Behind him, rows of green were just beginning to break through the soil, like tiny fists punching back at the past. And on his face, sunburned skin, tired eyes, but quiet fire that hadn't been there in months. My name is Blair Cole, he began, voice rough but steady. And I'm a farmer. I've been one all my life. I've lost more than I care to name: my wife, my daughter, my land. But a stranger once told me that some seeds only grow in ashes. So here I am, planting anyway. He held up the business plan Nora left behind, torn at the edges, smudged with soil, but still whole. If you believe food should come from honest hands and honest land, I could use your help. Not for me, but for the farm, and for everyone who needs a place to start again. He uploaded the video without any fanfare, didn't edit it, didn't script it, just spoke like a man who decided to keep going. And something about that honesty, that dirt under the nails kind of truth, touched people. By the next morning, it had been shared 3,000 times. By the end of the week, donations were pouring in. Small amounts, big ones, notes from strangers who'd never stepped foot on a farm. This reminded me of my grandfather. I lost everything too. Thank you for giving me hope. We believe in land like yours. Volunteers started showing up. A single mom from the next county brought her teenage son, said he needed something to believe in. A retired mechanic offered to fix Blair's old tractor for free. And a group of high schoolers came every Saturday, planting, hauling, laughing like they belonged. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a place people came to start over, to find quiet, to get their hands dirty, and remember what real things felt like. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't shout. It's speak with dirt on your hands and truth in your voice. Blair didn't expect it to grow this fast. But every evening, as the sun dipped low and the rows of green whispered in the wind, he looked around and thought, this is what happens when people stop waiting for permission to rebuild. And then, on a bright, quiet morning, when the farm buzzed with life and second chances, he saw her, standing just beyond the last row of kale, wearing the flannel jacket he thought she'd taken with her. Nora had come back, but this time, not as the woman who fell from the sky, not as an Everstone, just as herself. Let's talk about what she said, and what grew between them next. She didn't announce herself. There were no reporters, no entourage, just a woman in jeans and a straw hat, walking the edge of the fields like she'd been born there. Blair saw her from the wooden stage he'd built for the grand opening, where families were laughing, volunteers were unloading baskets of produce, and the new sign read, Farm of Freedom. He stopped mid-sentence, because it wasn't just that Nora had come back. It was how she came. No sunglasses, no title, no trace of the legacy that once overshadowed her. Just a worn leather journal in her hands, and eyes that had seen more storms than she'd ever let on. When she stepped forward, the crowd parted quietly, like they could feel something sacred returning. Nora looked up at Blair, and then she spoke, not loudly, not with flair, but with the kind of voice that carries when it's honest. I've spent most of my life doing what was expected, being who I was told to be, wearing success like armor, surviving accidents, dodging headlines. But the person who saved me didn't ask me to prove anything. He just let me exist. He gave me space to fall apart and put myself back together again. She turned to the crowd. And when I left this farm, I realized I didn't want to go back to the life I had. I wanted to live for the one I could grow from the ground up, not in boardrooms, but in soil, with my hands and my heart. And then her eyes found Blair's again. So I'm not asking for anything. I'm just here, hoping to stay. The quiet that followed was the kind that holds breath. Then Blair stepped down from the stage. He didn't say much, just wrapped his arms around her, the way you do when someone returns not as who they were, but as who they chose to be. And the farm, this place once built on survival, erupted in applause, not for the millionaire, not for the miracle, but for the choice, for the kind of homecoming you only earn by walking through fire and returning with your truth intact. Sometimes you don't need to bring anything with you. If you return with humility, with presence, and with love, you've already come home with everything that matters. That evening, as the sun spilled gold across the rows of basil and lavender, Nora and Blair sat side by side on the porch. No more secrets, no more titles, just a bench, a breeze, and two hands intertwined. But Blair had one more surprise, something he'd been building quietly, piece by piece, while he waited for a hope he didn't dare speak aloud. And in the softest moment of all, he finally showed her. Let's talk about the pergola, and the question that came with it. The headlines faded, just like they always do. Nora's story, the missing heiress who crash-landed into a stranger's life, drifted quietly out of the news cycle. And once the cameras turned away, once the last black SUV disappeared into the distance, the real work began. Because life doesn't wait for the spotlight. It grows in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the dirt. 1 year later, the farm of freedom didn't just survive. It thrived. Raised beds overflowed with heirloom carrots, kale, tomatoes the size of fists. The greenhouse buzzed with school kids learning how to compost and watching seedlings sprout like magic. A new barn stood tall, repurposed into a teaching center, part workshop, part refuge. Veterans, single mothers, teenagers with nowhere else to go. They came, not for pity, but for purpose. Blair worked the rows like he always had. Stubborn, steady, sleeves rolled up, but now laughter followed him. Now hands joined his. Now, the weight wasn't all on his shoulders. And Nora? She didn't reclaim her title. She didn't go back to boardrooms. She stayed. She taught flight theory to curious kids with paper airplanes and solar-powered drones. She helped women journal through grief and design second chances. She led with gentleness, not command, and she smiled more. The kind of smile that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. One morning, just as the sun brushed gold across the treetops, Blair led Nora to the edge of the property. There, nestled between wildflowers and rows of lavender, stood a small wooden pergola, cedar slats, hanging lanterns, vines beginning to creep along the beams, and beneath it, a bench worn smooth by hands and love. Nora touched the frame, fingers trailing over a tiny carving near the base. Grow here. Blair reached into his pocket. A small, hand-carved box. Inside it, a simple ring. Not gold, but shaped like a sunflower stem. A tiny wildflower engraved into the band. I don't have a cathedral, he said, and I'm no one the world will ever write about. But I have this land. I have these hands. And I have you. So will you stay? Will you grow old with me here? One season, one seed, one morning at a time. Nora didn't speak. She simply stepped into his arms, tears on her cheek, and whispered the only answer that ever mattered. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because sometimes love doesn't bloom in grand gestures. It takes root quietly, in broken places, beneath ash, beside those who choose you when no one's watching. Later that evening, they sat under the pergola, watching the stars wink into the sky, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand tracing slow circles on hers. She looked out at the fields, rows of green, humming with bees, glowing with life. You know, she said softly, the moment my plane started falling, I thought this is it. This is how it ends. Blair kissed her hair, but it didn't. She smiled. No, she whispered. It didn't end. It landed. And maybe that's the lesson hidden beneath all of this, that life doesn't fall apart to punish us. Sometimes it breaks wide open to give something else a space to take root. So if you ever felt like your story is over, like the crash is final, the fire too hot, the silence too loud, remember this farm, remember this love, and know that even in the most unexpected places, you can still grow. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories, where we share real, powerful stories that stay with you long after the last word. And before you go, drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one. We'd love to know.